Welcome to the Legal Leaders Podcast, brought to you by InView, LawView's community for in-house legal professionals, where we dive into the heart of the legal profession to bring you unfiltered discussions with industry titans on a broad spectrum of topics.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the Legal Leaders Podcast. I'm David Lancelot, the CLO and EVP Advocacy at LawView, and I have with me today Paul Peake, who is the VP and General Counsel of Food and B2C at Prosus Group. Thanks for being with us today, Paul.
Good to be here, David. Good to see you again, old acquaintances.
Yes, and you're coming to us today from Amsterdam, right?
Indeed. I would say sunny, but that is quite atypical in this country.
Awesome. Thanks for being here. And Paul and I met quite a long time ago. I don't know exactly number of years, but Paul and I both worked at eBay. And Paul, you were eventually at StubHub in London.
Yeah, you're making me feel old now, David, but I think we once met at an offsite somewhere in California many years ago.
Yes, many years ago. And clearly you have aged better than I have, even though you're much younger than me, obviously. So I think probably the best thing to do, and I was saying this earlier, is to start with just sort of your title and your role currently, because VP and General Counsel of Food and B2C really doesn't describe what you do. As I was saying earlier, to me, that sounds like maybe you're doing a lot of substantive legal work for a food and B2C business, but that's actually very different from your role. So maybe you could give everybody an insight to what you're up to these days.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess the title is a mouthpiece, and I think so. Don't worry, most people struggle to say it. You're not alone there, David. It's okay. Let's start with Prosus, and then we can connect the dots with what I do at Prosus. So Prosus is, it's the $100 billion company that frankly nobody's ever heard of. The story of Prosus is actually Naspers is the parent company, a South African company that is 100 plus years. Started as a print business in South Africa. And during late 1990s decided, hey, internet is kicking off. There's a digital space here. Maybe we should diversify and do something different in the tech space. And it made a very, in hindsight, smart investment, investing in a company called Tencent. And we've held a stake in Tencent now for the best part of 2+ decades. And to date, we own roughly a third of Tencent. So typically, nobody's ever heard of Prosus or Naspers, sadly, but many people have heard of Tencent by association. So that's the company. And then I joined Prosus 5 years ago, actually directly from eBay. And my role, I guess the title is slightly misleading, but Prosus, has roughly sort of 30 billion plus of assets under management outside of Tencent. And they kind of separate the investments into different investment thesis portfolios. So if I look at the ones that I'm responsible for, that includes all our food technology companies. So if you think about, an Uber Eats type player, we invest in similar players, albeit not in the US. I'm also responsible for our historical e-commerce portfolio. So, traditional eBay and the Amazon type companies of this world, but again, typically in emerging market countries. And then recently I look after the ed technology portfolios. And that's an exciting nascent new sector where we've seen the kind of continual thirst of, consumers at all ages, frankly, children as well as adults, looking to supplement their education and upskill. And these are technology platforms that provide that upskilling. So that portfolio is more US focused. Actually, it's different to the rest. It's less emerging markets focused. And then we have a small, I would say small, but actually it's a very successful payments business in Turkey that has become part of the portfolio. So that's the kind of portfolio mix. And then what I do is it's a real mix of M&A work, it's corporate governance work, it's compliance work. I actually wear dual hats for Prosus. So part of my day job, of course, is managing the legal work and dealing with legal topics. Increasingly, I take board roles as part of the portfolio company. So at the moment, I sit on sort of 4 or 5 boards across different market geos across the globe. And there, I'm really there to represent the interests of Prosus on that board. And it could be a combination of, companies that we own a majority stake. It could equally be a company where we own a minority stake, and therefore we don't always have the commanding voice in the room. Hopefully that, David, that gives you a quick kind of insight into what I do.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and as you know, Paul, I actually know a good amount about Prosus. Prosus and Naspers were a big competitor to the eBay Classifieds business, right? And I've always thought it had the most fascinating history, and the complexity and the level of sophistication in working, because of its history coming out of South Africa, I assume, but its comfort in operating in emerging markets, right? Like, and by emerging, it's like really emerging, not like American emerging, like whatever, name your country. So it's always fascinating to sort of work across against the Prosus crew, and then a real center of gravity in Amsterdam too, right? Which was
Yeah.
also where the headquarters for the business I work for, eBay Classifieds, was. So running into that team and that sort of ecosystem of talent, I always found it really really fascinating, and it's just such a great example of what I think of as real cultural intelligence. I guess I would call it super sophisticated cultural intelligence, where you have people who are operating in numerous, um, you know, really complex markets with a
Yeah.
lot of challenges, and doing it in a pretty successful way, right? I mean, it's tough to work across those markets, but to do it as almost like the business model is really an impressive thing. And
Yeah.
amazing talent too, right? Not to blow smoke, but I've met a bunch of people who worked in that organization, and it's really some pretty astonishing levels of talent. So,
Yeah.
congrats to you guys, and congrats to moving over there.
Yeah.
And I think with that as an intro, maybe we'd zoom out, sort of rewind now, and go back to the story, how you got to where you are now in a role that is very clearly not a pure legal job. If
Yep.
you were to look at Paul's LinkedIn profile, you'll see board seat after board seat. I've seen Paul, I mean, just last week speak in Scotland, but I've seen him in other places talking about his job on all these boards, and it is really fascinating to be operating at that level. But let's go back. Let's go back to early days, and your career journey and how you got there. So maybe over to you, Paul, on that.
Um, yeah, I mean, look, if you look at my LinkedIn CV, you'd say I'm, old school operator, spent a decade plus in operations. And I think over the last 5 years, I've increasingly transitioned to, an investor, frankly, more investor focused role. And I think that's, lent itself very easily to transition into taking on more board responsibility. Um, but to your point, I think if we just kind of zoom out, 15 plus years ago, I like setting the macro context to understand where my career kind of fits into that macro context. And I think, I've always said I'm a byproduct, frankly, of globalization. So, if you look at sort of, we come out of the Cold War, then we have the advent of internet, we have a technology boom and bust in 2000s, and then the kind of reinvention of tech, and particularly in the US, early 2000s. And I started my career at that point in time, 2007, I started practicing law. And, globalization, if you think about the supply chain infrastructures that were being built, companies wanted to globalize. And that created opportunity for me. So if I think about my career, I've been a global citizen, and I feel, frankly, very honored to be a global citizen. But it's because of that macro setting that's provided for that. My fear as in-house lawyers come into this afresh in the current age is that we're seeing actually a reverse of globalization. We're seeing, geopolitics that are lending itself more to kind of nationalization. Um, and I hope that doesn't hinder the opportunities for in-house lawyers that want, a global career path as I did. Um, so if I think about the very start of my journey, I was a private practice lawyer trained in London by a national firm, Shoesmith. And I'll be honest, David, and I hope folks at Shoesmith are not listening to this, but I didn't enjoy private practice. You know, I knew that kind of that place wasn't for me. Um, but it did, you know, if I look back at a younger Paul, I think it taught me the importance of detail. Details matter. Details as a lawyer are your foundations. Um, and I remember vividly a story, or not a story, an anecdote I'll share with you, which was I was doing an employment seat, and I won't name the partner, but it was fairly late at night, and they asked me to photocopy employment journals that used to be printed. There were no digital versions when I was there. And I photocopied hundreds and hundreds of pages, and I presented this with a smile to the partner. And she responded and said, "Look, there's a black line in the middle of the page." And I said, "Well, you cannot avoid that because it's the photocopy. You have to split the book in two." And she kind of marched me off back to the photocopy machine and kind of got my thumb and pressed it firmly against the photocopy, and then voila, there was no black line on the page. And it really has stuck with me. I mean, at the time, my thumb actually was in quite a bit of pain, but it really has stuck with me because the context was that was actually a litigation briefing file that was going to court. And, you know, details and, you know, impressions do matter. So I think it's a learning that I certainly took with me. Anyway, when I was at Shoesmith, I had an opportunity to get a secondment, which was almost like a release of life for a younger Paul, to Volkswagen. And I just loved it. Like, I loved every aspect of Volkswagen. I loved the connectivity between the teams, you know, across the functions. I enjoyed just having a product that you can be passionate about. And I think that that's a key as I think about, you know, building an in-house legal career. I'd always encourage folks to join a company that you're genuinely passionate about, understand the product, want to be a product ambassador. And I think your learning just becomes naturally, it becomes fun. And I think that's a difference when you don't have that connection with the product. Anyway, I left Shoesmith and this was in 2009 sort of crisis, possibly the worst time to qualify. And a friend at the time was working at the United Nations in Tanzania in a place called Arusha. And fascinating job. He was helping the prosecution chambers prosecute the 94 Rwanda genocide cases. So fairly sort of heavy and, you know, horrific stuff. And he said, "Look, we need lawyers, Paul. You know, can you come over to help a hand?" So I did. I kind of set off. I moved to Arusha in a tin roofed house with no running electricity or hot water. My girlfriend, my wife at the time, didn't particularly enjoy it, but I think we look back fondly of the time we spent in Africa. And my job was at the time, you know, reviewing witness testimony to figure out if there are discrepancies between testimony. And I won't share the details. This is a podcast, and people have to eat dinner at some point. But it was fairly harrowing stuff. I left the UN because a job came up at Adidas, and that for me was pretty much a dream gig. I mean, I played all sports as a kid, terribly at all of them, but I still enjoyed all sports. And then the opportunity came to join Adidas and, you know, connecting my passion with products that I believed in a company with a purpose I believed in. You know, that really for me was the Willy Wonka ticket. So I joined Adidas, relocated, and, you know, short story on Adidas, my in-house career. I started sort of in the UK and in a product sort of consumer facing role. So dealing with sponsorship contracts and, you know, marketing, consumer terms and conditions, and so forth. And then I relocated, to Amsterdam. And this has been my number one career learning. And I hope anyone takes it away, and I continue to follow it today. I always say yes to everything, stay humble, and be flexible. And that's exactly what I did at Adidas. The opportunity came up. They needed an antitrust specialist. I was not an antitrust specialist, quite the opposite. I knew nothing about it. And they said, "Hey, can you move to Amsterdam for a month to help the VP rolled an antitrust compliance program. So I did. I left within a couple of weeks' notice. I moved to Amsterdam. On the back of that, they said, "Hey, can you go to Hong Kong and do the same, help the APAC region?" So I relocated to Hong Kong. I left on 2 weeks' notice. Again, my girlfriend, my wife, wasn't hugely impressed with the lack of notice. Next thing you know, in Hong Kong. I'm traveling around Asia doing fundamentally a very different job than what I did at the start. So I think that's my looking back fondly at the time at Adidas was, just the importance of building relationships, and saying yes. If an opportunity comes, don't overthink it. Just really, move quickly, and you can always say no at a later point. I left Adidas for FIFA. I say Adidas was the Willy Wonka ticket. I don't know what other tickets better than the Willy Wonka ticket, but FIFA, if I had a preference on sport at the time, it was definitely football or soccer, as you folks like to say in the US. And, they came and was looking for a retail licensing type lawyer to head up their licensing function. And it was honestly the dream job. I mean, any employer that has 7 football pitches and actively encourages you to play football at lunch, they probably don't need to advertise too much for their jobs. FIFA was fun. It was a lot of travel. It gave me a lot of exposure to, in particular, Brazil. I traveled extensively around Brazil for the 2013 Confederations Cup and then the World Cup in 2014. And I spent a lot of time doing actually non-legal stuff. So when I was in Zurich, where the HQ was based, it was mainly sort of commercial contracting. And we can talk about my journey with tech later on, but a lot of the roles were kind of on-site activation, non-legal work you would sign up to. So I did all sorts in the Middle East. I used to go to the fridges in the player changing rooms and just make sure that the Coca-Colas of this world were correctly presented. I've walked around football pitches and made sure that the advertising of Adidas and Visa and so forth is correctly reflected on TV screen. Interestingly, you think those screens around a football pitch are in linear and in one line, and actually they're not. It's quite misleading. I thought it was quite interesting. They're all at different angles to capture the TV angles. Anyway, I digress. I think it's short. I spent a lot of time doing just really some random stuff. And again, the learning was be flexible. Stay humble, be flexible, build relationships. I could not stress that enough. I left FIFA for eBay. We relocated from Switzerland to the UK, and I joined eBay, which you will know very well. That was my first foray, I guess, into tech. And, boy, that was a wake-up call. I was like, wow, young engineers, they think differently, they look differently, they act differently. They're not sports jocks. So for me, this was a very, very different transition, a very different role than I've done historically. But loved it. This was, fast-paced, everything's changing. Gratification in product is almost instant. They can do A/B testing, on a spin. So I started with eBay in London. I did that for about 12 months, helping mainly their European merchant team. And then an opportunity came up to join StubHub. StubHub was the online ticketing business, very successful in the US, less successful outside of the US. And they just acquired a Spanish startup called TicketBiz. And as part of that, they wanted a lawyer to kind of come in and build out a legal function for StubHub. Assessing what the legal function is for the startup, and then combining legal function and having, I think at the time they were operating in 48 markets outside the US, and we needed legal support across those 48 markets. So we spent several years building out legal teams in what I call as regional hubs, so across Mexico, across Hong Kong, and Spain, so Madrid, Bilbao, and London. And, that was, for me, that was the first time I guess I had to, hire people, fire people, demonstrate leadership, create purpose and a goal, connect that with what the business is doing to demonstrate value add. Um, and importantly, my continued obsession with data and technology was also a big part of that role. So we had a sort of legal operations team fairly early on at StubHub. And I think looking back at what the time we spent at StubHub, we were in the trenches a lot. A lot of people wanted to sue us in many different markets. It was fun. Um, but I think the learning for me is I think about scaling a legal team, that's growing at triple digit growth across so many different countries is having one source of truth. And I say that not in the sense of just data, but common understanding of what it means to be in the legal team, common understanding of how the legal team fits into the business goal, common understanding of templates, processes, data, just having a sense of alignment and one source of truth for me is something I've definitely taken moving forward. Um, and then Process and Naspers came knocking, which takes me full circle back to where we began.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks for that, Paul. That's a really, really interesting journey. I think for anybody listening, it's pretty clear that, you've had a pretty good variety of businesses, business models, particularly locations. And then also, I'd say like different types of responsibility, right?
Yep.
And, especially coming into StubHub. And as you said, I can actually remember talking to you about that legal operations sort of
Mm.
role and the setup of it, and how at the time it actually seemed, I'm not even sure if controversial is the right word, but like just new, right? Like a new thing to think about, because this wasn't 2 years ago, right? This was a few years ago now. Not to age us, but it was a few years ago now. And the idea that,
Yep.
as you say, you would want a single source of truth, from both a like purpose and leadership perspective, but also management, people management, et cetera, and then all the way down to operations and data and reporting, et cetera. And you were clearly on the forefront of that. So I think that's a fascinating journey. And I mean, I'm feeling a little jealous, I gotta say, that you got to go to all those cool places. Not that I haven't got to go to millions of cool places too, and I should. Life is hard, but that's a really, really interesting journey there. So maybe we kind of switch gears a little bit and dive deeper into um, the the data part, the technology part.
Yep.
Because one time you said this to me, and I was like, "Huh, I've never heard anybody say that before." Uh, and I'll quote you: "Legal info is metadata." So, and put that on your book. Maybe we start with
um,
that. What
yeah, it's
maybe take you back a bit. What was it that started you on that journey? Right, where were you? Where you're like, okay, there's not a lot of transparency here. There's not a lot, how we used to do things in the old days, just react to everything. When did you shift gears and why?
um, I think I always struggled with the concept that lawyering was complex words and prose that was telling a story. Um, And, I try to look beyond the story and say all stories have often very similar components, start, middle, end, and often constituent parts of each part of the stage of the story. And I just got thinking more and more that are we overcomplicating lawyering? And I didn't want to kind of put myself out of the job 15 years ago, but I wondered whether the wrong lens was being applied to how we look at the legal world. So I always viewed lawyering, and the more contracts I read, I became, I shouldn't probably say this on a podcast, it's a bit geeky, but I became obsessed in my early career being the best commercial contract lawyer I could be. I read Chitty, every page of Chitty back to front. I used to print off thousands of pages of PLC contracts and I would just read them, keep reading every night, weekends. And I think my certainly my wife now thinks still believes that I'm a data geek. But the more I read the contracts, the more I realized that these are just metadata. It's just data points. The story might be different. It might be telling a different story, but fundamentally, the mechanics of the contract, it's 60, 70%, it's the same. So why are we, not viewing this in the same rules as the financial guys do with Excel and modeling? And I think about the sophistication that they were doing at the time. And they had tools, eBay time, back in eBay, they had SAP. Yes, it was clunky, but they had tools fit for the type of data they were looking to try and automate. And that didn't exist in League. And I think I got super frustrated. So my journey, to answer your question, began at Adidas, actually. I joined, fresh out the blocks as private practice. And I realized that the team were doing hundreds of sponsorship contracts. And don't get me wrong, they were sexy. When you're dealing with David Beckham and Jessica Ennis and all these, big stars, it's great. But again, I couldn't disconnect from the point that this is the same data. It's just metadata. So I started playing around with macros. I think was the first thing that I did. I created a macro on Word. You probably remember this. You go in, you have your template fields, and it pre-populates the contract. Super basic, but it's the only tool I had at the time. And look, I sent this to, I remember sending this to the business folks and even my own legal team. And I'll be honest, they didn't love it. I think their initial reaction was, whoa, lawyer and special. Like, this ain't data. We're telling a complicated story. So, I kind of chipped away and I kept using the macro, but not with great success, I'll be honest. And then I fast forward, I skip across to FIFA, and I see the same issue. You have standardized templates, same contracting issues, same metadata, but a huge reluctance to embrace technology or embrace a lens other than the complicated legal world that we're used to. And one of the first things I did was create, as part of the infrastructure required for the licensing team, I created a macro. Same story, and I gave it to the business folks and said, guys, you don't need me. Here's the macro. And, FIFA at the time had a lot of negotiation power, so it wasn't that much actually was negotiated. And they loved it. They're like, hang on, Paul, I can get a response back on the same day, because they would fill in the macros, countries, dollar amount, products. They send it to me. I quickly scan it, review it, give it back to them. They'd go. And I think that's the first time I saw a positive response in my career to looking at it in a data lens. I thought, hang on a minute, maybe this is worth pushing the needle, pushing against, the resistance on this. So that was kind of FIFA. I had a smell of success, albeit very small. And then by the time I got to StubHub, at least, and eBay, I think I had the platform and scale to justify it. I think that's the key difference. The concern at the time, and you'll probably laugh at this, but tools were fairly nascent in legal tech. We were using essentially what I think are finance tools repurposed essentially for legal. They were clunky, they were dated, there was no UX, output was terrible. But that was my starting point. And I think when I realized the tools were not great, one of the first things, and credit actually goes to one of the hires I made in London was a chap called Riaz, and he was also fascinated with technology and still is today. He's with me at Prosus. And, we both came to the conclusion that if the tools are not there, why don't we pause and just focus on data? And I think, if I had one learning for anyone thinking about this is, you're only as good as your data. And so we spent most of our time, certainly the first couple of years, just making sure we have structured data. It's boring. It doesn't sell magazines. Internally, people don't like it because it's not glossy, but it is the building blocks, I think, to a decent output model, with or without tools. So we spent a bunch of time reviewing all the contracts. We did an AI pilot. This was before AI, I think it was just LLM learning, but they would ingest the contract, extract the metadata, and then we had, the basis essentially of structured data for the bulk of our contracts, and then we started thinking about different use cases. So, regulatory. Why don't we have structured data for regulations across the globe? It's pretty much the same, albeit they will be different. And how do we standardize the outputs? So, is a regulation applicable? Yes. Is it applicable to all types, one type, two types? So thinking more and more around how we standardize it. And then we had a tinker. I'll be honest, the tools definitely were not there at the time. I'm showing my age here, but the output tools were just not there. So I think what we struggled with was demonstrating to the business that this adds value. It allows them to make good decisions, more efficient decisions. I think that's probably where we struggled to get buy-in from the business, because we couldn't demonstrate output. So we used Google Analytics and Google Sites, and I think we used Tableau as a plugin at the time. And we had internal actually output visualizations based on the structured data that we had. Pretty basic, showing how much you've spent, regulations, different countries, searchable information on contracts, but fairly basic. So I think looking back on that experience, I probably try to force the use case. I think I was so excited to take the structured data that we spent building and creating use case without really thinking through, is this a value add use case? Not just, for us, the legal team, but also the business case. I think, maybe in my eagerness to demonstrate progress on output models, I wanted to throw every use case I possibly could at it. And even if I think about, fast forward to my role at Prosus, as a non-operating company, there's less, I guess, opportunity for you to introduce more, both structured data and outputs of general legal technology tools. We do use it. It does exist. But I think I spent more time at Prosus just pausing, understanding the data, and then not pushing use cases that don't make sense. Only push use cases that actually demonstrate value to the team and to the business, and the business will buy into. And specifically at Prosus, if I think about the types of sort of tools and legal technology that we use as a team, I mean, one of the first things we do, we have a lot of portfolio companies. And one of the things I noticed was and this is, again, pretty basic. This is not sexy legal tech, but we were asking from the portfolio companies so much information. A lot of it was the same information, and across all different formats: Excel, PowerPoint, Word, some tools, some online tools, some in-house tools, some external tools. And actually my journey at Prosus on tech was just taking stock and saying, okay, right, let's have one source of truth. These are our portfolio companies. Let's make their jobs and lives easier. Let's just have one tool that captures everything in, a systematic way and is structured. All the data is structured. I'm borderline obsessed on this topic. So we kind of did that. And then in parallel, just to kind of, I guess, a call out the Prosus, not me personally, but the Prosus invested in AI. I want to say invest, they built in-house AI capability even before ChatGPT. In fact, it was one of the first participants in the ChatGPT open licensing. And so I think they were very quick to see the AI trends and what it could do for the business, and started deploying that, for the portfolio companies. And I think not the miss for me, but the next opportunity is connecting that in-house know-how to legal. I think we spend a lot of time, rightly so, deploying AI to enhance the companies that we're investing in. And I think that's a very kind of attractive add-on for our capital. I would love to take the power and the knowledge we now have in-house and think about, how do we use that AI for some of the use cases that we work on? Harvey AI is one thing that we're kind of trialing now to try and automate and institutionalize the knowledge we have around contracting on M&A. But I think M&A as a whole, it's interesting. It's another area of, I think, back 15 years ago, where you have a natural resistance to viewing these contracts as data. I think M&A is a similar world. If you think about the McKinseys, the banks, they love PowerPoints, they love storytelling. So viewing and simplifying that as data, It's not easy to convince this cohort to do it. So I think that's probably my next both challenge and opportunity.
Right on, right on. Yeah, and obviously we're speaking the same language there, and I think it's almost, I don't know, ironic that we've had a relatively similar journey, but and maybe maybe a bunch of our listeners have too, right? Who are of a similar vintage and have worked at various businesses. Because if you're sort of tech forward, coming out of .com times, whatever, and wanting to run your function like the business unit that it is, there's been just years and years of frustration, right? Where it was sort of just like, and I can remember being at eBay and just the ops team would come to me and say, what is it that you want, David? And I'm sure they did the same to you, right? Like, what is it that you want? You're always asking for the thing that we don't have yet, if you know what I mean, right? Like, what's your dream? And for me, it was always dashboard. I want a comprehensive dashboard, right? That tells me, and they were just like, tee hee hee. He's the guy that always asks for the thing that isn't, possible. And, what you said about having to use finance systems, there's still, and I have to say, in my role now, there is a lot of that still today. There's a lot of um, still operating as if legal was an in-house law firm providing substantive services and having no quantitative information. But I think there's a lot of us now in the in-house profession who are, have come up as much more business people with legal skills than legal people working in a business. And we just we're frustrated to see that there aren't systems in place already, right? And if you look at the spectrum from tech companies all the way to over to whatever continental European enterprises, you'll see there's all kinds of stuff going on in this space. And I think we're really at an inflection point now where there are tools, right, that are available off the shelf or off the SaaS that can do all the things that we've been wanting to do for so long, right? And so now all of a sudden you've got that. You're extremely fortunate if you have structured data, but these tools can actually structure it for you, right? They can ingest and structure. And now I think the conversation is actually on the cutting edge where, you certainly are, and others, of your sort of mindset. Now the conversation is exactly as you said, like, what is it that we can actually do that is valuable to the business with this information, with the reporting, with the analytics? And I had a wonderful conversation with a lady in London who told me your legal metrics are boring, right? And by that she meant, it's great to know how many of this and that and how much you spent, et cetera, et cetera. But the business actually doesn't care that much about that, right? The CFO actually does, of course. They want to make sure you're not overspending and just wasting money that could be spent on more product development, more marketing, or whatever. But what the business really cares about is its strategic objectives. And how are you linking that information that you have, the systems that you're now able to buy, how are you linking that to the business's strategic objectives? And that is actually a really exciting place for, I think, in-house lawyers to be, right? Because we're finally at that almost that same point where finance, HR, sales, and everybody else is with a sort of comprehensive, transparent view into what our function does. And we can align that now. Now, the next step is aligning that with what are the strategic objectives of the business and the purpose of the function itself, right? What is the purpose of the legal function? Is it really just to provide a bit of legal advice and then say, scary, give me more resources? Or is it to drive the business, to drive the strategy, and to be a competitive advantage to our businesses? And I think with your sports background, I'm sure you have plenty of sports analogies for that. Yeah, so I think fascinating tech journey there, mate, and I totally am on your wavelength.
But I think, David, to your point around, demonstrating sort of value and how this fits into the organization that we work today, if you think about the workforce transition journey as well, and I think that's maybe AI, but legal tech generally becomes even more interesting. Gone are the days where folks make, a career choice and, still with the same company in 30 years. We now have a very transient workforce, and increasingly we've moved from, industries where, technology and, products focus was the source of revenue to human capital is the source of revenue. You look at, just the S&P 500, the technology stocks are there for a reason, and they invest heavily in their people. Um, and you think about the legal function and, how it manages this sort of very transient state and how quickly it loses institutional knowledge. I think technology will have an increasing role on plugging that gap. I think about, in our world, for example, we're a deals organization as well as an operator, but we're constantly looking at the same issues, the same geos. We have an emerging market focused. And, how often have you or I, or frankly, any in-house lawyer said, oh, yeah, we've looked at that before, but it was done by Bob, and Bob left in 2005. Um, and then you're kind of crawling through, SharePoint sites or Google Drives, whatever you're using. This can be solved with a chatbot where all your knowledge is institutionalized, is ring fenced from a data security perspective. And you can interact with a chatbot, that's more efficient and, more accurate than any human could possibly be. So I think that's what excites me. If I think about the issues that the future workforce faces and what it means for the company, and how legal in particular have, that impact and risk greater, I think, than perhaps other functions. I think technology is a real enabler in this.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. And I love your analogy to, Bob. Bob leaves the company. I've actually been somewhere sitting in a meeting at a very big corporation where we'd spent a couple of months getting ready to do a licensing deal when we all get together in that room and somebody walks in and says, "Oh, is that what you're talking about? Oh, we did that a few years ago already." And it's just sort of like, sorry, how much time and effort did we waste? And I'll put it in sort of, legal tech and maybe even law view terms, but matter management, right? The part that's been missing for so long for me, I've done a ton of contract management, a ton of electronic billing, et cetera, and that's old school and table stakes now, right? But I think the big gap has been, how are we collecting the information and sort of codifying it for each piece of non-contract work that the legal function does, right? Such that when Bob goes on holiday, or Bob leaves the company, or Bob takes on a different kind of opportunity within the organization, right? And I think
Yep.
that aligns really well with what you were saying about what I would call the diversification of the profession, right?
Yep.
Like, you no longer have to go straight up to general counsel or you're a failure, right? There's all kinds of opportunities. And, it, as a leader, it's a really, really valuable thing to be able to say, I am not concerned about moving what Bob is doing to Judith, right?
Yep.
Judith can take that over because in our matter management system, everything's in one place. I don't have to dig through 5 years of SharePoint to find it, right? So I think it's very transformational to move there, and gives everybody on the team more opportunities and gives leadership more ability to manage in a sophisticated way, as well as all of that information is data, right?
Yep.
So everything that happens in that system, whether it's the business saying, "Hey, I need some help," or the lawyer saying, "Just go look at this thing," it's all collected as data. You can run your analytics, and the sort of modern best practice. The analytics are great. The graphics are impactful. You don't need to spend 3 months making your own PowerPoint slides. Even though your guys from Bain and McKinsey would be like, "But I can make them really well." It's like, yeah, that's great, but I don't. That's not our USP, right? That's not what we do. Make PowerPoint slides. That's what consultants do, and maybe they won't
Yep.
do that so much anymore. Who knows? But I think that's also a fascinating area of discussion. And I think maybe, as we're running low on time here. I think we should
Mm.
probably talk about um, business leadership,
Hmm.
and your thoughts about that sort of round out this discussion.
Um, yeah, sure. I mean, look, I think my overarching theme on business leadership, and it took me, I want to say the best part of a decade to get comfortable with this, but be an authentic leader to be effective. And I think my advice to myself, a younger Paul, or frankly, anyone coming into the in-house profession would be, if you don't feel authentic in your role or the organization, you're probably in the wrong place. I think find a home that you can be your true self. And I think once you do that, you will open up yourself and vulnerabilities and access and, stakeholder building. I think it will become more naturally if you feel authentic in how you operate. So that's super important as I think about, how I try to demonstrate leadership and be a leader. Um, a couple of thoughts sort of building on that. One, I think we get caught up a little bit in this world around leadership means seniority. And I think it's wrong. I think leadership is level agnostic. Genuinely believe this. And again, if I think how, I think I did reasonably well as a young in-house lawyer was because I was curious. I asked a lot of questions to the business. I held the mirrors up to the business, and I had the confidence to push back and be a source of resistance. And I think that is leadership. That is leadership in its basic form, but it's very effective, and it allows the businesses to really engage with you. And then by that you become a go-to destination point, frankly, for the business. Um, I guess a few other points, and I talked about this previously, but have a passion for the product. Know the product, understand the business, read the annual report if it's public. Yes, it's 300 pages and boring. Actually, it tells a great story, a very good story. Understand the P&L, understand the stress points of the business, understand who the shareholders are, who owns the business, what do they want for the business. I think the more you can, and I think the more passionate you are about the product, the easier that journey comes for you. Um, if you want to be a global in-house lawyer, and for me that was very important, I made a deliberate choice to travel the world. I think it's probably because I come from Wales, and Wales is a small place, and I therefore wanted to rebel against that and see the rest of the world. But if you think about in-house lawyering and being a business leader, I would say, think globally but act locally. So, don't give business context or advice or demonstrate leadership that's relevant for one market that's ignorant to the next. And I think that took me a while to understand, but generally understand the local context and not just, reading the paper or doing a Google search. Get in the country, speak to people, understand the local politics, understand what inflation rates are, get a pulse on the consumer sentiment, what's causing them concern, what's not. Genuinely understand the market if you want to be a global leader. And I think finally, if I think about my own career and what business sort of leadership mean, for me, it means saying yes to every opportunity. So it's linked back to, the first conversation we had. Be flexible, be humble, and try to take on projects that are outside of your lane. So whether it's legal, whether it's HR, whether it's comms, I think it applies equally to any sort of functional role. I think I've been very lucky in my career where I've just put my hand up and I said, hey, I can do that. And I've been lucky enough that the organization has trusted me to do it. And often those opportunities have come from, stuff that people don't want to do. Often it's not sexy, it's not cool, it's long hours or it's weekend work. But in terms of the richness, I think, of that experience in what it kind of allowed me to do today, I don't think I would feel confident or comfortable taking the board roles had I not had these, varied mix of non-legal roles. And like I said, making sure Coca-Cola bottles are presented in the correct way, in the Middle East, it's not sexy, but it's all part of the journey as you think about, enriching your sort of business acumen.
I actually think that some people are going to hear that and go, "No, Paul, aligning Coca-Cola bottles at football matches in the Middle East is sexy. Certainly sounds pretty sexy to me." There are some roles where you don't get to go to the Middle East to soccer matches. But yeah, I totally get your point. I mean, and yeah, I I've had many conversations with people on my teams where it's, understanding the language of the business, really getting into the products, and as you say, being passionate about what the business does, which allows you over time to build up that business acumen that all the business leaders need. And I think there was one thing you said there that really resonated with me, as we'd say here in Silicon Valley, and it was like, when so I've had a journey of leadership where I was always trying to figure out what is it that the business people want from the people on my team, so they can get their seat at the table, own that seat at the table, right? And eventually, after speaking to many GMs and CEOs and whatever, I came back with, they want to be challenged, right? They want you to, in a not in a silly, uneducated way, but in a really, I understand the business. I'm a member of this leadership team, or I'm a leader. You don't have to be a member of the leadership team to be a leader, right? You just have leadership,
Yep.
sort of way of operating. And they came back and they said, I want somebody who shows up at our meetings or Slack messaging groups or whatever, and challenges what we're doing in a productive way. And I think you've exactly aligned with that, and it's great to hear that you're thinking in the same vein as I am.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing I think and I'm still on this journey myself, in what makes an effective board role and a board member, and how do you translate that into your day job? How do you make it tangible? And I think the more time I spend on board roles, there's two things that I keep coming back to. One is, I think we have especially as lawyers, we have a natural gravitation to risk, and we probably sweat the small stuff on risk more than we probably should. I think risk in equal measure is opportunity. So I think balancing how we think about risk as an in-house lawyer, I feel more challenged than ever to not sweat the small stuff, view risk through the lens equally of opportunity. And then the other piece, and I think you've touched about this, around being challenged. Challenge when you have the same level of understanding and information. And I think sometimes lawyers, they're so engrossed in the detail. By the time they have this conversation, they're so excitable, they forget this information asymmetry at probably most levels of the organization. And as a board member, that's even more, frankly, you know, accentuated, because we had, one step removed from the operating business. And I see this with GCs that come to the board, and, they're super excited. They dive into details. And I think sometimes it's difficult to have that conversation. So I think, to your GM's point, they want people that can have a conversation and challenge them at the right wavelength and level, I would say. So, think more in concepts than detail. And I think that will allow the lawyers to have certainly a more meaningful engagement with audiences that necessarily don't have that same information base.
Yeah, and I think what I've seen missing at all levels of all companies is an understanding of executive communication, right? Or just communication. I don't even know if it's necessarily for executives, right? It's this idea that, like, succinct synthesis is probably the most important and valuable thing you can do, right? You do your job great, whatever it is, but then you come to the table and here's the 3 bullet points and here's the ask, or here's the 3
Yep.
bullet points, and there's no ask. I've communicated what I needed to communicate. Do we need to have any discussion on this? If not, great, and move on. Yeah, absolutely, super valuable. Well, Paul, we could go on. There's a lot more to talk about here, but I really appreciate you being with us, and I hope everything keeps going well in Europe for you, and hope I get to see you again in person soon. Thank you for being with us.
David, thank you for the trip down memory lane. And look, I hope the conversation was helpful to at least a couple of individuals that may or may not listen. But pleasure as always to see you.
Yep. And thank you, everybody, for listening. This has been the Legal Leaders Podcast brought to you by LawView. Thank you very much, and see you next time.
If you enjoyed listening, please hit follow and leave us a review on your listening platform of choice. We love engaging with our community and hearing from you, so please head to inview.lawview.com. Thank you so much for tuning in.